This is The Strategic Leader, the podcast that helps people-focused leaders to think, act, and feel more strategic. And in this Series 5, we are exploring Tales from the Top Table. We're looking at the senior leadership team, what's involved in operating strategically in that team, and we've got both guests and our own perspectives to share, and we hope you find it useful.
Hello and welcome to The Strategic Leader with me, Fee Craig.
And with me, Gemma Bullivant. And we're delighted also to welcome another guest. We've got Steve McNicholas with us. Hi, Steve.
Hello, ladies. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon. And Steve, I'd love it if you could share a bit more about yourself.
Happy to, Gemma. So my background is effectively leadership. Having been in many, many different roles, many different sectors, I have the bumps and bruises as well as some successes. So consider myself very much a practitioner of leadership, and have spent almost 30 years attempting to master this. 2/3 of that in the corporate, some big blue chip banks that you will have heard of, one or two big insurers. And my last decade in employment was working in the private equity sector. So jumped about, parachuted into a number of organizations to deliver some sort of strategic objectives in that space. But ultimately, I had the chance, Gemma, Fiona, a number of years ago to pursue my passion to try and help and support leadership in their development. Wrote a couple of books, stood on some stages, and thoroughly enjoy what I do today, which is working with groups of leaders, cohorts of leaders, and helping them, sharing some methodologies on how to be effective in this space. And then we go away and try and implement it. And that's what I do today. And I'm super proud of it. And I've been very fortunate that I've held a number of C-level executive roles. And one of that was for about 3 or 4 years was Chief People Officer, when we had the rather challenging task of pulling 3 separate organizations into one.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? That you've held different seats at that top table. And we always say that top table can be C-suite, or it can be kind of senior leadership team level. It doesn't really make much distinction for our purposes. But interesting that you've held 3 different roles at that top table. And I also really like your expression of bumps and bruises gained along the way, because we learn so much from what hasn't worked as we do from what has worked. I guess let's start by thinking about stepping from that idea of stepping from a functional lead. So your day job is running that part of the business and you're very much in charge or heading up a slice. I often think of it as a Trivial Pursuit cheese that goes into that goes into the little round thing. Your responsibilities goes from leading that team. You're the top of that wedge of pie, and you're shifting into a leadership role, and you're being asked to effectively run the business. And what's that like? If you can remember what it was like for you, or any other observations about when you've seen other people do it. What happens when you're stepping into that new space?
Yeah, I quite like this Trivial Pursuit circle slotting the triangles, I think they are, aren't they? So it's a while since I played that game, but yeah, it's quite a good analogy actually, Fiona. There is a fundamental expectation or identity shift that most leaders underestimate. The siloed expertise, and I mean silo in a positive sense here, not negative. The siloed expertise that got you there is not necessarily what keeps you there. And it's the challenge to develop the breadth and not always falling back to the security blanket of, well, I'll just stay in my little area of expertise. I think the other obvious differences that I noticed when I think about it, and again, I see leaders grappling with it even today, is what I call the emotional thermostat, the temperature that you set when you walk into a room or when you walk into an organization. Your impact is significantly more, whether you think that or not. How you act, how you respond, how you behave has far greater implications at senior executives level than it ever did in the functional line. And it's being cognizant of you as the thermostat is very important, because, people know that you carry some seniority, and therefore there is an expectation that they respond to that seniority. So you have to be very mindful of how that's perceived. And when I go back to things I see practically today, They are very, very self-confident in the subject matter expertise. But in those first 3, 4, 5 important weeks and months, when they're asked to give a perspective broader than that, there is a nervousness. There is a, well, surely I can't be as knowledgeable as my peers around this table here. And actually the reverse is typically true. So that would be an immediate observation as to some of the challenges.
I love that. So there's two really big things there, and I think it's probably worth us looking at both of them. The first one that I heard there was depth versus breadth, and that whole challenge of lifting up out of the depths and bringing the breadth. The second one was your emotional thermostat, which is an expression and an idea that I think is really worth us exploring. And so let's start first with depth and breadth. One of the reasons I've pounced straight on that is I think it might have been in our very first episode, which I love. I love that actually is where we started. That's almost the foundation stone for strategy. And one of the foundation stones that we explored in that very first episode was depth versus breadth. And
All
this
right.
idea that being strategic at any level, when we're looking at things through the lens of being strategic, we do have to ensure that we are looking broadly as well as deeply. And so it just feels great to hear that coming through, doesn't it, Fee? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know. I thought exactly the same, thinking, oh yeah, that's one of our pillars from certainly series one. It might even have been episode one, mightn't it? I'm also thinking about it from a kind of systems perspective, that systems thinking, which is not just how will this affect whatever it is, how will this affect my team, but how will this affect the business, or how can I consider what the impact of this decision is going to be on the finance team and on the sales team and on the IT team, and thinking broadly, how can I build up my experience? And it's really interesting. The thought I had when you mentioned that first point was that lack of confidence, that point where you're stepping into a more senior role, you've sort of been bestowed with this senior job title and this responsibility. You shift into a new room, a new table, where you suddenly realize you don't know as much as you thought you did, or you don't know as much as everyone else, or you think that your voice may be less valuable than everyone else's. And that perhaps is a kind of confidence trick that we don't anticipate. We want to get that role. We aim towards that role. We apply for it. We get it. It's brilliant. I'm now at this top table. And then you kind of go, oh shit, I don't know what I'm talking about. And that is definitely a kind of loop that I've certainly encountered people falling into. So that kind of just be prepared for that. And it isn't that you can't do it. It's that you probably haven't thought about it. Don't let it trip you up into thinking you can't do it. It's just a different way of thinking about things that you need to get used to. It's not something that's beyond you.
Now, when I think as well, Fiona, that it's quite instinctive. We all sort of prefer our security blankets. We like the conversation to go towards the area where we feel we have an opinion and we have experience. And typically, we're often at a senior table, there is the sales leader, there is the people leader, there is the finance leader. So it's very, very clear what hat or badge everybody's wearing. And when that conversation does fall to the people, if we're talking about HR in this sense, then the new leader, the new executive feels confident. Well, I probably know more than everybody around the table. So there is a confidence there. Or they may not have a perspective, and therefore, again, are people consciously not expecting the new people leader to contribute on a sales problem or a financial problem, but it is something that new senior leaders have to grapple with and have to forcibly try.
Yeah, I want just to go back to one thing you said. It's a fundamental identity shift. It's about how you see yourself, isn't it? So instead of seeing yourself as I am an HR lead, or I am a this lead or that lead, that doesn't go away, but we have to add on, actually, I am an executive now. I am responsible for helping to run this business. And that's a new identity I need to step into. I think one of our other episodes from series 5 actually is around, do I have the right to talk about these broader business issues as an HR person, for example? Well, yes, you do, because you are on that top table. So you may well have an HR or people focused tint to your answer, but you do have a right to chip in and have an opinion and ask questions and provide some value on all of those other things. So that is an identity shift as well as a confidence thing and as well as a knowledge thing, which, you may well legitimately have to build up. But I like what you said about, having to kind of think about yourself differently. And that often isn't always anticipated. It's just something that crops up afterwards and go, oh, right, I wish I'd known this before.
Absolutely.
So I really like that.
It's not just a right, is it? And that's usually the first and biggest hurdle, but it's actually an expectation. I mean, we would suggest with our 3 hats idea from the first episode of this series is that we've got those 3 hats. We've got the functional leader hat. That's our expertise. That's our functional expertise. But we have also got the organisation, enterprise-wide, the breadth leadership hat too. And so we don't just have the right to do it. That's actually one of our roles, is to operate in that mode. And so you're absolutely right to call it out as an identity shift, and really bring that awareness to yourself to not only give yourself the permission to operate in that mode, but to make sure that you do operate in that
Well,
mode.
so true. And I was asked by a young lady, I'm trying to think, 3, 4, 5 weeks ago, who was grappling with sort of this issue. This was a finance leadership role where she was stepping up, and we were having a conversation over coffee outside of the program. And sort of she shared this observation, and she's like, well, I'm finance, but the sales side of it, I'm still, and the people side of it, I'm still, and the sort of go-to-market product and technology side, I'm still. And the way I suggested to her to look at this is that when you were the finance director, who is accountable for the finance numbers? Well, you. Now that you've stepped into this executive capacity, who's the owner? Who are the owners of the enterprise outcomes? So ultimately, who is accountable for the performance of the enterprise? She said, well, everybody around the executive table. So absolutely. So therefore, that absolutely gives you the mandate to ask, to probe, to share thoughts, because you're ultimately accountable. As much as the technology lead is, you are ultimately as accountable about the technological performance of the organization as he or she. That goes with the seat.
Totally. And you said 3 words there. You said ask, share, and probe. So 2 of those 3 words are asking questions.
Absolutely.
And or challenging. And often where we come unstuck when we're in this mode is that we don't feel we've got anything to share, which was one of your 3 words. But we absolutely can ask questions. We absolutely can probe or challenge or get a bit deeper into someone else's area. Because all that does is it enables the conversation to be had at that level and not just let everything be assumed to be whatever that functional leader is bringing. It's such a critical part to play. And, that's certainly my top tip is if you don't feel like you've got something to offer in the context of not necessarily feeling like you are the functional expert, you must have some questions that you can offer that feels like that has to be your go-to to enable you to be part of that conversation, but in a useful way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
we've talked, haven't we, before about where do you add value, which maybe starts to take us into the next part of the conversation. But you can add value by your subject matter expertise, but you can also add value through your good questioning, through your reflecting back, through your summarizing what's been done, through your bringing in alternative perspectives, or, how does that relate to this or that? They're still questions. You don't have to be the subject matter expert, but you're enriching that conversation. And, if as a team, we are responsible for these enterprise outcomes, then in an ideal world, as a team, we are all responsible for supporting each other. So if it's a finance challenge, it shouldn't just be a finance problem. It should be, we've all, we can all help this person or contribute to this person being able, maybe they will be responsible for resolving it, but they're all going to, it can be very lonely at the top, can't it? So if in an ideal team, we've got a bunch of peers who are all lined up next to me wanting to support me and able to offer me that support, even if that support is just really good questions or really good observations or really good summarizing or this is what it looks like from my part of the business. And I think that maybe takes us into that second big point that you made right at the beginning, Steve, which is that lovely, lovely language of thinking of yourself as an emotional thermostat and how you show up. And I'm sure we've touched upon ideas like this before, but I really get exactly what you're talking about. What happens, I think about it as the kind of the shadow or the glow that you cast as a leader gets much stronger as you become more senior because you are simply more visible and you are kind of bestowed with this slightly holy thing which we call authority, which, we could do a whole podcast episode on authority, but nevertheless, how you show up, how you enter a room, how you greet people, how you tackle challenging conversations, how you bring people into the conversation, all of those things have a massive impact that we can be incredibly unaware of. So I'd be really interested to hear just a little bit more about how do we build an awareness of that and how do we use it to give ourselves better outcomes?
Yeah, I do like that thermostat reference. When the house is cold at home and somebody adjusts the thermostat, everybody feels it. I want to talk first of all on this about the negative implications of not being aware of your impact when you make that next step, what it really feels like in the organization. And it's something that I think a lot of people who make the next step aren't aware of is you almost put a marker down as to what's tolerated in this business or in this organization by how you behave, by how you act. Some of the things you just articulated a few moments ago, Fiona. And it's like how would I describe? It's like an invisible tax. It's like a tolerance tax that if you retain that functional, I suppose, mindset of, well, when I led the HR function, I was okay if that happened and I'd let that go. And that probably wouldn't be an issue because I sort of knew the background to it. You can't know that background when you move to enterprise level. So what I see happening, and it becomes difficult to undo it, which is why I think it's such an important point to share early on, is you have to be very, very mindful of what you demonstrate as tolerable or what you personally tolerate, whether that's commitments, whether that's how you speak, whether it's the narrative over evidence, etc. Because it's very tempting to keep the peace as a new executive, to say the things that make people feel, oh, well, that seems nice, or that seems sort of, I'm glad he or she's now on the executive team. But actually, it's the signals, both visible and invisible, that you're sending out there that, this is tolerable or this is what I tolerate. And it's tied very much into the thermostat of you don't want to paralyze yourself, but you want to be mindful of it because it's very, very difficult to untolerate behaviors and actions that you've sort of walked past.
I really like your point about it's really important because these things are very difficult to undo afterwards. So an awareness of them is really critical. I really like that description of, that temperature in a room is part of the culture. We can often talk about a kind of climate as well as culture, can't we? So I think that's a really interesting one. And the way you show up. I mean, I often think a lot about who you are is how you lead. It's not necessarily, I mean, obviously there are tasks in there, the things that you do, but often it's just simply about who you are and what energy you bring, or what, in your language, kind of what temperature you're bringing. Are you literally warming things up and making people feel a bit more comfortable? Not necessarily by being nice, that's a word we've struggled with, but by being clear or by being decisive or by being straightforward, being transparent, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Or are you kind of lowering that temperature by being secretive, political, these kinds of words? I really like that kind of cultural impact aspect that perhaps we don't think about at that point.
And also the unintended impacts of how we show up. So we may not realize that other people see us in a particular way. I remember coaching a leader who was really struggling with the idea that people found them quite aloof and cold. And what it turned out was that what they were doing every morning was getting very focused and heading straight for their office and focusing on what they needed to do, but not really saying hello to too many people as they were walking through the office. And that's a very simple example, but that person was not in any way intending to be cold or aloof, but that is how they were coming across. And just by some really small moderating behaviours, through raising that awareness, being cognizant that that actually might be the impact of that behaviour in that room, they were the leader of the business.
Yep.
It enabled them to intentionally think, as I'm going through the turnstiles, I'm going up the lift into the office space, I will actually engage with a few people and I'll just say a few quick hellos and check in on how people are. Not spend ages, don't need to kind of completely shift over to the other side of the equation, but just tweak that behavior made a huge difference. And they didn't change who they were as a human being, they changed how they showed up as a human being.
Yeah, and we will hopefully move off this silly radiator thermostat analogy. I did think we are going to do that.
I think there's a lot of mileage in this. We could
But
keep going
even
for ages on this.
I know, but even that example you just shared there, Gemma, it's only 1 or 2 degrees, and yet the impact, everybody feels a bit warmer. And it's subtle, it's tiny, but that's the impact when you get to that level of every little subtlety is magnified multiple times over, often for good, but sometimes for the worse.
And I'm also thinking about the point you make that when you're shifting into this more senior role, more visible, more of a headline role, the behaviors that perhaps would have been tolerated before when you were kind of within your team environment. So yes, I'm an operational lead. I need to be seen to be working hard. My team know me. My team know that I like to get my head down in the morning and maybe I'll chat more in the afternoon. Those behaviors that weren't necessarily bad at that HR director kind of level
Yep.
suddenly don't work when you get to that C-suite or that SLT level.
Yep.
I guess back to your point that you made at the beginning, which is what got you here won't necessarily get you there. So it's not that the behaviors have changed. It's just that that's fine at that level, but at that more visible level.
I think there's a third point to build on this, just as we're concluding the conversation here, which is around something I think, Fee, you've mentioned in previous episodes, again, going back deep into the archives, around ownership and accountability. So I remember us having a conversation about an experience you had in one of your earlier leadership roles, Fee, where there was this idea of coming back from a leadership meeting and not owning the decision that was reached in that room, and somewhat almost divorcing yourself from being part of that team and almost explaining some sort of difficult news as, well, it's what they decided, as if you're not part of the they. And I feel like this third point of ownership and accountability really plays into stepping from functional to enterprise, whereby sometimes we may not either agree with what's been agreed collectively, or we may not like it, or it may present us with some challenging conversations to have as a result of that. But there is an enterprise accountability that needs to be owned and relayed in the right way when we take news and information back to our teams. Do you remember that, Fee?
I do, absolutely. And yeah, like detaching yourself from the decision. And I suppose that disagree and commit principle, which is, you may have a different view, but and I guess particularly at that level, you're making decisions on behalf of the entire business, considering the impact across the whole system. It may not be the best outcome for your functional team, but it may be the best outcome for the business. And so you're going to have to take that bad news back into what may be perceived as bad news back into your function. We're not going to do it the way that you wanted to. We're going to do it a different way, and being able to kind of represent that team back into your functional sort of sweet spot. That's really uncomfortable because, going back to your comfort blanket, I guess, Steve, that idea that, I feel quite protective of this part of the business. And again, that sort of comes back to the identity shift thing that you mentioned at the beginning.
Well, I'm going to pick up on the accountability word, because I think that's just prompted me to think of back to the start of the conversation, actually, Gemma or Fiona, when you said, what do I notice as the biggest difference, or some of the differences from functional to more enterprise or executive? And that accountability word sort of reminds me of, I suppose, another challenge that many, many individuals face. It's that confusing activity with accountability. And what I mean by that is, as the functional lead, when I think about HR, I would see a functional leader talk about, well, we've delivered X programs and we've got this number of delegates, and there's a functional activity sort of mindset and thought process. The difference, though, at the next level is a much more accountability mindset of the programs and the numbers and the headsets and who's been to that. That's irrelevant. That's functional. What the leader has to show at the next stage is the strategic enterprise impact of what that functional thing has actually done. So this is more about, we're tackling a strategic leadership issue of A, B, or C. And when you said that accountability word earlier, Gemma, that was what prompted me to think of, this is another headwind that new functional leaders hit when they make that next step up, is they think the way to justify is, here's my shopping list of functional things we've done. What the next table is looking for is accountability for the enterprise problem that you're fixing. And, I do see leaders struggle with that step. To get there, of course they can get there, but it is natural to go back to the comfort blanket of, let me tell you how many things we've done.
I definitely have done that, and I've been pulled up on it. Years ago, I absolutely remember that. This reminds me of one of my favourite models, the what, so what, now what model. It's tempting to stay with the what. I've delivered X. We've got so many delegates. We've got this program's finished. This program's underway. That's the what. We need to move into the so what. So we are improving retention levels, or so we are upskilling our capability with AI or whatever. That's the so what, which we definitely need to be shifting into. And then the now what is strategically, this is what the future is going to demand of us. One of those very early pillars that we talked about, as well as the breadth as well as depth. We talked about the timescale and the horizon, and that it's not about what we've delivered or what we are in the process of delivering. It's what's the future going to be demanding of us? What's our future strategy needing? What's our future market? So that shifting from the what to the so what and the now what feels like a summary of what you just said then, to kind of say, well, this is why it's important.
That's a great observation and a great recollection of one of my all-time favourite models as well. What, so what, now what? Love it. So there is obviously an awful lot to the whole question of moving from being a functional leader. What do we also need to think about as being an enterprise leader? We've covered three big areas there in terms of the depth and breadth, that emotional thermostat idea, and the idea of accountability and ownership. There's probably more, but I think all we've got time for today is those three. I think they are three really helpful areas. Steve, is there anything that you can add?
I suppose if there's one thing I want to leave anybody with, as much as we've talked about the challenges, it is very, very achievable. I've seen many, many functional leaders step up and be incredibly powerfully impactful executive leaders, making an impact wide across organizations as opposed to their subject matter expertise. So I wouldn't want anybody listening to the three of us this afternoon thinking, goodness, this sounds like climbing Mount Everest. It is a challenge, but actually it's very, very achievable. And it's just about being aware of some of the challenges that are likely to come and preparing yourself for it. But actually, it's a great ride. It's a wonderful experience. And if you get to that top table, it's because you've deserved to be there. So that would be my take. Some reassurance that it is very, very achievable, Gemma.
Wonderful. What great comments to close on. We'll put ways to contact Steve into the show notes, if that's what they're still called these days. And thank you so much for joining us, Steve, and giving us your time and your experience.
Thank you, Steve. It's been really, really fascinating to talk to you. As we always do, we all learn something new. And we really hope that you have all enjoyed listening. Join us next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. We'd love it if you could subscribe or maybe share with a colleague or just leave us a quick review.
And if you have a big, hairy question you'd like us to explore, or perhaps a strategic dilemma you're wrestling with, just drop us a line, gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk.
And remember, having a strategic viewpoint doesn't necessarily mean having all the answers. It's more about asking better questions, broadening your view, and staying curious.
We'll see you next time.